Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to Drawing Down the Stars. I'm Snappy, and thank you for joining me today for our live reading of Apuleius's Metamorphoses, or the Golden Ass. We're back with part 8. This is going to be a fun read. It's been a bit of a wait getting to this particular episode, but thank you all for bearing with me and for the constant changes. But today is the day I got some time. I'm going to sit down and we're going to go through the rest of the book, hopefully. I'm going to read for as long as I am able, and we'll see how far we get. It should be fun. All right. So let's start by first doing a discussion and a recap of the previous book in the series where we were at. So if we remember, we were reading book 7. And in book 7, where we left with Lucius, where we left Lucius, is he's in the brigand's cave, right? The cave of these robbers, these pirates, and he's a donkey, right? He's turned into a donkey, and he's been caught with this maid, right? So what happened was there's this fair maiden who was kidnapped by these robbers, taken from her wedding, and Apuleius and her, or sorry, I should say Lucius. Yes, Lucius the donkey, and and this mysterious maiden tried to escape from the robbers, and they got caught, and the robbers freaked out, and they decided that they were going to have to punish these poor people, that they were going to have to enact their revenge because they were blaming them for all of their ill fate. And so they decided that they were going to do something truly horrific, that they were going to rip open Lucius, cut him open, remove his guts, then stuff the young maiden inside, and then expose them on the rocks. But they decided they're going to wait to the next day to do this, and leaving the poor maiden and Lucius absolutely terrified. But, well, all this is going on, and they go to have their feast. A mysterious stranger shows up, this kind of a giant of a man, and he introduces himself to the brigands as the famous robber Hymus of Thrace. And he tells them this wild tale about how he lost all his power and everything, and how he wound up there. And through this tale, he basically says and convinces all of these men to respect him and admire him. And they're lacking leaders because, as we learned, remember, in the previous stories, they had lost 3 or 4 of their leaders in the previous robbery attempts. So they were desperate for new men. They were leaderless. And in walks in this sort of famous, infamous pirate, this giant of a man. So they instantly believe him in his story, and they decide to make him the leader of their brigand group. They dress him in a purple cloak, they put a crown on him and everything. And at this point, he asks what kind of loot they have, and they reveal to him the maiden and the donkey. And he sees the maiden chained up, and he's just kind of like livid, upset, but he doesn't say anything. And they tell him their plan, what they intend to do, how they intend to enact their revenge on the maiden and the donkey. And Hymus turns to them and says, now, I don't want to tell you guys what to do. This was a decision you made before I was here, but I can't help but speak my mind on this because I have a strong belief that profit for robbers should come above everything. And he goes on this kind of diatribe about how they should sell the donkey for meat, and how they should sell the woman as a prostitute in the city, and that he even knows some guys who will pimp her out. And the men kind of relent, and they decide that that's what they're going to do. And they decide now that they're going to continue with this celebration, and they are going to have a sacrifice to the god Mars in order to inaugurate their new bandit king. So they go, and Hymus magically is able to find some kind of herd and gets all these sheep mysteriously. When they thought it would have been a problem, he gets it mysteriously. And they bring the sheep, and they have all this wine that they managed to steal without any issue. And they throw a massive party. They sacrifice a bunch of these sheep to Mars. They all get ridiculously drunk. Except Haemus. He doesn't drink anything. And all of a sudden, all of the men start passing out. And then he goes back to the maiden in chains and reveals himself to her to be her fiancé, what is it? Telepolemus. Telepolemus. Sorry. Telepolemus. That's a mouthful. Telepolemus. All right. So he reveals himself to actually be Telepolemus, her husband, and they wind up going back to this village where they're from, gathering a bunch of men, coming back, finding all of the brigands still drunk. They tie them all up and they arrest them. They throw a big party and they decide to get married, finish their wedding. So Charity and Telepolemus get married. Her name is revealed to be Charity. And at the wedding feast, our man Lucius gets a ton of barley and a huge amount of food. And he's kind of pissed off about it because he doesn't want that food. He wants better food. He wishes he was a dog. It's a pretty funny moment. But what ends up happening from here on is Charity speaks up for Lucius and says that he should be treated well and he should, something good should happen for him. So they try to devise, some kind of kindness that they can do for him. And they decide that the best thing that they can do would be to send him off to the stud farm to be able to go and live with the horses and have his fun with the mares and make a few mules. So that's what they decide to do. But when they take him to this stud farm, he's immediately taken in by the wife, who abuses him, beats him, forces him to work this mill and to grind grain, even gives him out to their neighbor and makes him do the neighbor's grain and takes all his food that he gets from the neighbors. It's like, just torture, right? And then they finally go, okay, we'll put him out to the pasture. So he thinks his life is going to get better. He goes out to the pasture. He's imagining himself hooking up with all these mares, and the stallions all freak on him, start trying to eat him, rip him apart, kicking and beating him. He was almost certain he was going to die. And he's in constant fear and running. And he's like, I can't keep doing this. So again, he thinks fortune has changed and smiled on him. And the young son of the wife and the stud farmer, he takes in Lucius and decides to use him as a pack mule to carry his lumber and to go up the mountain. But this is the worst possible fate, because this young boy is a monster. And he relentlessly tortures Lucius and devises all kinds of wild ways to torture him, including tying a bunch of burrs to his tail and then having something that burns him in the front of his face. So no matter if he goes fast or slow, he's getting tortured. And just keeps beating him. And he's going to kill him. He's eventually just torturing him to the point where he can kill him. He's kind of a sick, sadistic person. But one day when they're going up the mountain and he's pushing the donkey to the extreme, poor Lucius, when they get to the top, there's a she-bear. And Lucius panics, knocks off the young man, and knocks off all the lumber, takes off down the hill. And the young man gets ripped apart by bears. So Lucius keeps running down the hill, and he gets picked up by a stranger on the road who thinks he's his donkey. And then the townsfolk come in, and they're looking, the stun farmer, his wife, and a bunch of their servants. They confront this man and the donkey, and they go, hey, that's our donkey. Why'd you steal our donkey? And this guy's like, I didn't steal anything. I just found him wandering. And they assume he's a thief, and they beat him up, and they kidnap him. It's pretty wild. And then they decide to go up the mountain, and they find the body torn apart. But they don't realize it's a bear. They don't know what happened, and they gather up the body so that they can bury it. But now everyone is thinking it's like some kind of monstrous thing that happened. They don't know what happened. But everyone is upset and looking for someone to blame, and they all decide to blame Lucius and this poor man. They decide they're going to take this poor stranger off the road, and they're going to send him to the city where he's going to face justice from the magistrate. And they decide that they're going to cook and decapitate Lucius the donkey. But they're going to do so tomorrow. It's always the next day, right? So he gets put back into the stables, and in the middle of the night, while he's trapped in the stables, the mother, the wife of the young boy who was ripped apart, that woman who first tortured him when he arrived at the farm, she's devastated, and she blames Lucius for everything. So she takes him and ties him down with his legs spread out so he can't fight back. And she takes a branch and starts beating him. And she beats him and beats him and beats him until she is exhausted and can't beat him any longer. And it's at this point that she goes to the next extreme, and she grabs a hot poker and she takes it and she jams it in between his legs into his thigh. And at that moment, he freaks out and he evacuates his bowels right into the lady's face, his last and final defense. And she's just freaking out and drops what she's doing and takes off to go get clean. And Lucius is left, burned, beaten, spread eagle, tied with ropes. That's where we left our man. That was the end of, of book 8. Our poor donkey Lucius is in quite the predicament. So we're going to now hop over to our topos text here. So 1 second. Let's see. Okay. So here we are. 8.1. Perfect. Okay. Book 8. The Tale of Thrasyllus in Charity. Right, it's Thrasyllus in this version. It's not Tlepolemus, I think. I was reading, Thrasyllus. Okay, or Thrasyllus. We'll see what's going on here. Who's Thrasyllus? All right. Book 8, The Tale of Thrasyllus in Charity, Mad Desire. A cock crow, a young man, apparently a servant of Lady Charity, she who had shared my suffering among the robbers, arrived from the nearby town. Sitting beside the fire, amongst a crowd of his fellow servants, he had a strange and terrible tale to tell of her death and the ruin of her whole house. Grooms, shepherds, and herdsmen too, our Charity is no more. My poor mistress, and not alone, has joined the shades in a dreadful disaster. I want you to know all, so I'll relate what happened in order. Events that deserve to be recorded by some historian more gifted than I, whom fortune has blessed with a more stylish pen. In the town nearby lived a young man of noble birth, whose wealth was equal to his status, but he was a devotee of the taverns, spending his time each day whoring and drinking, consorting with gangs of thieves, and even staining his hands with human blood. Thrasyllus was his name. Such were the facts as rumor relates. When Charity first reached marrying age, he was among her principal suitors, and eager to win her, though he was the most eligible of them all and tried to win her parents' favor with lavish gifts. Yet because they disapproved of his character, he nevertheless felt the pangs of rejection. Despite our young mistress's union to the worthy Tlepolemus, Thrasyllus still nursed his thwarted desire. Fueled also by resentment at being denied the marriage bed, he sought the opportunity for an act of violence, and when such a chance presented itself, prepared to execute a plan he'd long meditated. On the very day the girl was freed from the robbers' threatening weapons, by Tlepolemus' cleverness and courage, Thrasyllus, with overt expressions of joy, joined the host of well-wishers. He congratulated the newlyweds on their found reunion, and expressed the wish that their marriage might be blessed with children. And out of respect for his noble lineage, he received in their home as a welcome guest, hiding his guilty intentions. He passed as the truest of friends. Soon, by his frequent attendance at dinner parties and assiduous conversation, he became a closer and closer intimate, until gradually, unwittingly, he slipped deeper and deeper into the abyss of longing. Inevitably so, since while with the slight warm the first flames of cruel love bring delight, with familiarity's fuel they blaze higher and consumes us totally with their incandescent heat. Thrasyllus meditated for a long time on how to proceed. He could find no opportune way of speaking to her in private. The path to adultery was barred by a host of watchers, and even if the strong ties of her new and growing affection for her husband could be dissolved, and the girl were willing, which seemed inconceivable, her inexperience in the deceits of marriage would thwart him. Yet he was impelled by his ruinous obsession towards the impossible as though it were a possibility still. When love gains intensity with the passage of time, what once seemed difficult seems easily won. Watch then, and pay close attention to my tale of the ruinous violence of mad desire. The tale of Thrasyllus and Charity, the murder. One day, Tlepolemus rode out to the chase with Thrasyllus, intending to hunt wild beasts, if hinds can be classed as such. Charity, being unable to endure the thought of her husband seeking creatures armed with tusks or horns, they came to a slope with a dense covering of trees, where the foliage hid the hinds from the hunter's view. Hounds bred for tracking and pursuit were ordered in to flush the deer from their haunts, and the well-trained pack split to surround all the approaches. At first, they held their nose and worked silently. Then at a signal, they created a fine uproar with their harsh and frenzied barking. But no gentle female deer, no roe, no hind, gentlest of all the creatures appeared, rather a huge boar, the largest ever seen, bulging with muscles under its coarse hide, coated with shaggy matted hair, with a ridge of bristles flaring along its spine, and eyes alight with a menacing glare. Out it shot like a lightning bolt, flaying its tusks, foaming at the mouth, and snorting savagely. At first it lunged this way and that at the boldest hounds which ran in close, slashing them to pieces with its tusks. Then it trampled the hunting net that had halted its first charge and broke right through. We servants, used to innocuous hunting parties, were seized with terror, lacking weapons too or means of defense, so we fled and hid behind the tree trunks and bushes. Thrasyllus, however, having hit on the perfect opportunity for his treacherous designs, cunningly tempted Tlepolemus. Why are we standing here in dumb confusion, as stupidly afraid as those useless slaves of ours, trembling like frightened women? Why let so rich a prize slip from our grasp? Let's mount and overtake him. You take your hunting spear, and I'll fetch a lance. Without hesitation, in a trice, they leapt to their saddles and eagerly pursued the beast, which halted and wheeled about, confident of its natural defenses. Burning with savage fire, it glared and whetted its tusks, hesitating whom to attack first. Tlepolemus began the action, hurling his spear from above into the creature's back. But Thrasyllus ignored the prey, and instead hamstrung the hind leg of Tlepolemus's mount with his lance. Blood spurted, and the horse sprawled sideways, hurling its master to the earth. In a moment, the maddened boar attacked him where he lay, slashing his clothes as he tried to rise, and then his flesh. Not only did his fine friend show no regret for his evil action, but as the stricken Tlepolemus tried to defend his lacerated legs and pitifully begged for help, Thrasyllus, not satisfied with merely waiting for the outcome of this cruel threat to his victim, drove his weapon through the right thigh, all the more resolutely confident that the wound from his lance would be taken for a gash from the wild boar's tusk. Only then did he run the creature through with a simple blow. When his young friend's life had been ended in this way, Thrasyllus summoned us all from our several hiding places. Rushing to the spot, we grieved to find our master dead. Thrasyllus, meanwhile, though overjoyed at his enemy's demise and the fulfillment of his plan, masked his delight, furrowing his brow and pretending to mourn, passionately embracing the dead man, that victim of his own devising. He cunningly imitated all the mannerisms of one bereaved, all except the tears which refused to flow. So by aping the emotions of we who were truly bereft, he laid the blame for his actions on a wild beast. The crime was scarcely committed before rumor slipped away and in her winding course, reaching Tlepolemus's home, first came to the ears of his unfortunate bride. When she heard the news, the worst imaginable, she lost her mind and spurned on by madness, she ran delirious, raving through the public streets, then the open fields, wailing her husband's fate in a crazed voice. Sorrowing citizens flocked to the scene. Those she met followed her, sharing her grief. The whole city turned out at the spectacle. Behold, she sought her husband's corpse, and with failing breaths collapsed over the body. Almost at that moment, choosing to yield the life she had pledged to him, yet her relatives succeeded in dragging her away, and thus she remained unwillingly alive. Meanwhile, the whole city followed after the funeral procession as his corpse was borne to the tomb. The tale of Thrasyllus and Charity, the vision in sleep. Thrasyllus wailed louder and louder, beat his breast, shed those tears absent from his former show of grief, no doubt through suppressed joy. He feigned truth itself in his many terms of endearment, invoking the dead man as friend, old playmate, comrade, and brother, and invoked his ill-starred name. Every now and then he caught Charity's hand to stop her from beating her bruised chest, tried to restrain her mourning, quell her cries, and dull the sting of grief with sympathetic words, spinning tales of solace from the past examples of the vagaries of fate. But all these false acts of devotion merely indulged his desire to touch her body, fueling his odious desire with a perverse pleasure. Once the funeral rites were duly completed, the girl was in haste to join her lost husband in the grave, considering all possible manners of dying. What happened? Considering all possible manners of dying, but choosing the slow, non-violent path of pitiful starvation and self-neglect akin to encroaching sleep, hiding herself in the deepest shadows, already done with the light. But Thrasyllus continued to urge her, partly alone, partly through family and friends, and then lastly through her parents, to care of her dull, neglected flesh, to bathe and to eat. Out of respect for her parents, she reluctantly yielded from a sense of moral duty, exercising the daily acts of living as they now pressed her without a smile, but calmly and quietly. In her heart, though, or rather deep in her marrow, she tormented herself with sorrow and grief. She spent every moment, night and day, in sad longing. She had statues made of the dead man in the guise of Dionysus, and slavishly worshipped them in sacred rites, tormenting herself in acts of devotion that gave her solace. But Thrasyllus, as rash and headstrong as his name, which signifies boldness, refused to wait till morning had stilled her tears. The pain in her troubled mind had ease, and grief had ceased, spent by its own excess. Though she still wept for her husband, tore her clothing, ripped at her hair, he offered marriage, and imprudently betrayed the silent secret of his heart and his own unutterable guile. Charity shuddered in horror at his wicked words, her body trembling, her mind clouded, as though she'd been struck by the power of the sun or the thunderous effect of Jove's own lightning bolt. After a while, she regained her breath and began to moan like some wild creature, perceiving at last Thrasyllus' vile plan. She asked her suitor to grant her a breathing space in order to form a scheme of her own. And in those hours of delay, her chaste sleep conjured the ghost of the murdered Tlepolemus, his flesh pale and lacerated, but stained with blood and gore. "Wife," he began, "though no one else should ever call you by that name, if the memory of me is locked in your heart, but the bonds of our love are severed by my bitter fate, and you choose to wed again and be happy, do not accept Thrasyllus' impious hand, and sleep with him, or share his table, or even speak with him. Spurn the blood-stained hand of my killer. Don't enter into a union stained by murder. Those wounds whose blood your tears laved were not all made by the wild boar's tusks. Thrasyllus' wicked spear it was that parted us. And the spirit added all the details of that scene in which the crime was committed. Charity still lay with her face pressed against the bed, just as she had lain on falling asleep, exhausted from weeping. Now her cheeks were drenched again with a flood of tears as she woke from her troubled dream, as if in torment. She mourned once more with her heartfelt cries, ripped her gown, and beat her sweet arms with cruel hands. Yet she kept that night vision from everyone, concealing utterly its revelation of crime, while privately she fixed on punishing that foul assassin and ending her life of suffering. Behold, that detestable seeker of mindless pleasure was there again, his talk of marriage beating at her closed ears, but she rejected his offers mildly, playing a part with wondrous skill, as she fended off his endless harangues and his humble prayers. The lovely face of your brother, my husband, still lingers in my eyes, she said. The cinnamon odor of his ambrosial body still haunts my nostrils. Handsome Tlepolemus still lives within my heart. It would be in your own best interest to grant a wretched and unfortunate woman the true period of mourning, until the rest of a full year has passed. It is not a question simply of my own honor, but of your security and advantage, for a premature union might cause my husband's wrathful spirit to rise up in righteous indignation and put an end to your life. But Thrasyllus was neither chastened by her words nor satisfied with the promise of winning her in time. He importuned her time and again with perverse whispers from his foul tongue, until at last she feigned to give way. You must grant me this one thing, Thrasyllus, though. I beg, she cried. We must keep our union secret. No one in my family must know of our clandestine relationship until a full year has run. Thrasyllus yielded, subdued by the girl's false promise. Suppressing his eagerness to possess her, he agreed to their meeting covertly. And be sure, she said, to come to me alone, without a single servant and shrouded in your coat. Come silently to my door at midnight, then give a low whistle. My old nurse will be waiting behind the locked door for your arrival. As soon as she lets you in, she'll lead you to me in the dark, so no lamp can give us away. Vengeance. Thrasyllus was delighted with his faithful promise of union, suspecting nothing but simply complaining in the eagerness of his anticipation at the length of day and the never-ending twilight. When the sun at last gave way to night, he appeared, cloaked as Charity had commanded, and lulled by the feigned caution of her nurse, slipped into the bedroom filled with hope. The old nurse, following her mistress's orders, spoke soothingly to him, bringing cups and a jug of wine, secretly dosed with soporific drugs. He quaffed several cupfuls in quick succession with greedy confidence while she explained her mistress's delay with the lie that she was tending to her sick father. She soon had him asleep, and once he was flat on his back and defenseless against harm, called Charity. She entered and stood by the murderer, bent on attacking him, possessed by a man's fury. See, my dear husband, this mighty hunter's now, she cried, your oh so loyal friend. Here is the hand that shed your blood. Here is the brain that planned that fatal ambush to destroy you. Here are the eyes that sadly found me fair and now foreshadow future darkness. Anticipate the punishment in store. Sleep peacefully, Thrasyllus, and sweet dreams. I shall not tackle you with sword and spear. You shall not know a death to match my husband's. You shall survive. Your eyes shall not, nor shall you see nothing except in mind. I shall have you feel your enemy's death to be less pitiful than your life, nor more light for you. You'll need some servant's hand, for you'll not have charity. There'll be no marriage. You'll know neither the peace of death nor the joys of life, but wander a restless phantom between Hades and the light, seeking to find whose hand destroyed your sight, and never knowing. A thing bitterer than all in your suffering, whom to accuse. With the blood from your eye sockets, I shall pour a libation over my Tlepolemus's tomb, and dedicate your orbs as a funeral gift to his blessed spirit. But why should you profit now from my delay, and dream of my touch that instead shall bring you ruin and the torment you deserve? Leave the dark of sleep, wake to another, the darkness of avenging night. Raise your ruined face, know my revenge, realize your fate, enumerate your torments. So let your eyes grant pleasure to a chaste woman. So let the torches darken your marriage chamber, for the Furies shall attend your nuptials, and loss be your supporter, holder of the eternal sting of conscience. Foreshadowing her actions with her words, she now took a pin from her hair and drove it through Thrasylus's eyeballs, leaving him blind and rising now from sleep and drunkenness to inexpressible pain. Then grasping the naked sword which Tlepolemus once used to arm himself, she ran wildly through the streets, making for her husband's tomb, clearly intending to do herself harm. All the people poured from their houses, and we pursued her, urging each other on to wrest the weapon from her hands. But at the grave, Charity kept us all at bay with that gleaming blade. Seeing how copiously we wept and variously lamented, she cried out, "Quench your untimely tears, don't grieve for me, in ways ill-suited to my virtuous deed, who have found vengeance for my husband's foul murder, by punishing a man who sought to destroy the sanctity of marriage. Soon I must seek with this sword the road to my dear husband." She told us then all the things that his ghost had told to her in dream, and the cunning way she had trapped Thrasyllus and harmed him. Then she plunged the sword into her left breast and fell in her own blood, murmuring incoherent words as she bravely breathed her last. It was left to Charity's friends to bathe her body tenderly, then swiftly lay her beside her husband, his eternal partner in his shared tomb. All this being known, Thrasyllus sought a self-punishment to match the tragedy he himself had brought about. More than death by the sword, a means too slight for that great a crime. He was led to the grave, crying out repeatedly, "Vengeful spirits, behold, here is a willing sacrifice." Then he closed the doors of the tomb tightly on himself, condemned by his own sentence, intent on starving himself to death. Wow. New travels, fresh troubles. The countrymen were deeply affected as he told his tale, with deep sighs and occasional bursts of tears, fearing the changes a new master might inflict and profoundly pitying the misfortunes visited on their former master's house. They decided to flee. The man in charge of the horses, who had been so strongly recommended to take good care of me, stripped his house of whatever had of value and piled it on the backs of myself and the other pack animals, then abandoned his old home. We were loaded with women and children, hens and pet sparrows, little goats and puppies. Anything whose weakness might hamper our flight took advantage of our legs, but the vast weight I carried was no burden to me. Here was joyful escape at last, and a fond goodbye to the threat from that vile castrator. We crossed the rugged heights of a wooded mountain and traveled the length of a low-lying plain beyond. Just as twilight darkened the road, we came to a busy, prosperous town. There, people advised us not to go forward that night or even at dawn, saying the place was infested with packs of enormous wolves, of vast size and weight, that plundered at will with relentless savagery. They lay in wait by the roadside like robbers, attacking the passers-by, and in their wild hunger stormed neighboring farms, so that human beings were threatened now, not merely defenseless sheep. Then they told us the road we would have to take was strewn with half-eaten human corpses, and the fields about gleamed with white bones, stripped of their flesh. We must travel with utmost care, they warned us, alert to the threat of ambush on every side, and only in daylight, well after dawn, when the sun was high in the sky, since the dreadful beasts showed less aggression in the presence of strong light. If we traveled in a tight wedge-shaped convoy, not strung out along the road, we might make it through. But our useless leaders, in their blind and reckless haste, fearing pursuit, ignored this good advice. Without waiting for dawn, they loaded our backs and drove us along the midnight road. Fearing the dangers prophesied, I guarded my flanks as best I could against the wolves' attack by hiding myself at the heart of the throng of the closely packed animals. All were amazed to see how I matched the other creature's swift pace, but my speed was no sign of zeal, but rather cowardice on my part. The thought occurred to me then that the mythical Pegasus had probably taken flight from fear, and so was described as winged, when he had merely reared in the air and leapt to the sky, frightened of being scorched by the fire-breathing chimera. The herdsmen driving us were armed as if for battle, with javelins, lances, and hunting spears, clubs, stones from the rocky path, and sharpened stakes, and they carried fiery torches to scare off the ravening wolves. We were only lacking a bulge or two to make us a marching army. But those fears were imaginary, those anxieties were in vain. Rather, we fell into a far worse trap. The wolves were frightened away, maybe by the noise of the throng of men, or the bright light of the torches, or perhaps were simply prowling somewhere else. In any case, none came near, nor were even sighted far off, but the laborers on an estate we passed, thinking we were a band of robbers, terrified for themselves and their possessions, set their dogs on us. These were enormous savage creatures, fiercer than any wolf or bear, well trained for guard duty. They urged them on with the usual shouts and cries, so their inborn aggression was intensified by their owner's racket as they ran at us, swarmed around us, and leapt on us from all sides, ripping at the animals and men alike, and dragging us to the ground. What a spectacle more worthy of tears than telling! By Hercules, as a swarm of excited dogs caught at those who fled, clung to those who stood still, clamored over the fallen, and worked their way through our whole convoy with their hot, slavering jaws. In an instant, this perilous danger was followed by far worse trouble. The farmers began to hurl rocks at us from the rooftops and slopes nearby, so that we were in two minds which threat to guard against most, the guards nearby or the stones from afar. One of the latter struck the woman seated on my back. When she felt the sudden pain, she screamed and wept, shouting out to her husband, my overseer. He called on the gods for help, and staunching the blood from his wretched wife's wound, cried out in a massive voice, "Why attack and assail us so viciously? We're poor men, just weary travelers. Where's the profit for you in this? What theft are you out to avenge? Are you beasts from some lair or cave-dwelling savages that you seek your pleasure in spilling human blood?" At this, the shower of heavy stones ceased. The vicious dogs were restrained, and the noise subsided. One of them called down from the top of the cypress trees, "We're not thieves or robbers either. We were only defending ourselves from any attack from you. So go your way quietly and in peace, secure from further trouble." That was that. But we all took the road bleeding from various wounds, gashed by rocks or fangs, or hurt in some other way. When we'd gone some distance along the trail, we came to a neat plantation of tall trees, all carpeted with meadow grass, where the troop chose to rest for a while for refreshment, and to tend their various wounds. They collapsed on the ground to recover their breath and regain their strength, then quickly began to treat their hurts, washing the clotted blood away with water from a nearby stream that flowed besides the grove, applying vinegar-soaked sponges to their many bruises and bandaging welling cuts. every one of them looking to themselves. Eaten alive. Now an old man appeared, gazing down on us from a summit at hand. A goat herd he was, as could be seen by the she-goats browsing round him. One of us asked him if he'd any milk or curds for sale. He shook his head several times before replying. How can you dream of food and drink, or anything else right now? Don't you know where you are? Then he gathered his goats and made off into the distance. His words and sudden flight filled us all with no little dread. We wondered what was wrong with the place, but there was no one the others could ask, till a second old man approached on the road, tall and bent with the years, hunched over his staff, wearily dragging his feet and weeping copiously. Meeting with us, he clasped the knees of all the young men in turn, racked by tears. May fortune and your guardian spirits smile on you, he sobbed. May you be healthy and happy when you reach my years. Only help a wretched old man, save my grandson from death, and spare him to my old gray head. My sweet comrade on this journey, he was trying to catch a sparrow singing in the hedge when he fell into a pit that yawned at its feet. And now he's doomed to death, though I know he's alive and he calls to me, and his weeping, I am too weak to save him, as you see. But your youth and strengths could easily aid a poor old man and save the youngest of my line, my only heir. We were all filled with pity as he begged us to help and tore at his gray beard. One of the younger men, stouter of heart and stronger of limb than the others, the only one of us uninjured in the recent battle, leapt up readily and asked where the boy was. The old man pointed with his finger to a clump of bushes, and the youth set off in his company. When we animals had grazed and the humans had tended their wounds and were refreshed, we all rose with our loads and started down the road. At first they shouted and called the young man's name repeatedly. Then, anxious at his delay, they sent someone off to find their missing comrade. Tell him we were off and bring him back. Soon the messenger returned, trembling and pale as boxwood, with a strange tale to tell of his friend. He had seen his body, he said, lying on its back, almost totally eaten by a vast serpent. The snake was coiled above him as it consumed him, but the poor old man was nowhere to be seen. Hearing this and matching it to the goat herd's earlier remarks, who must have been warning them of none other than this same denizen of the place, they fled from that pestilential region, traveling more swiftly than before, driving us along rapidly with repeated blows of their sticks. After a long day moving at a breakneck pace, we came to a village where we stayed the night, a place where a noteworthy crime had been committed, which I'll relate. A servant, whose master had made him steward of his entire estate, had previously acted as bailiff, therefore of the large holding where we had stopped for the night. He was married to a servant in the same household, but burned with love for a freed woman who lived outside his master's estate. Angered by her husband's disloyalty, the wife set fire to his storeroom and all his accounts, destroying both utterly. Not content with this act as revenge for the insult to her marriage, she turned her bitter rage against her own flesh, tying a rope round her own neck, that of the child she'd just borne her husband. She hurled herself into a deep well, dragging the infant with her. Their master, horrified at their deaths, had the servant, whose infidelity had provoked the dreadful tragedy, arrested, stripped naked, and smeared with honey, and tied to a rotting fig tree, inside whose trunk lived a colony of nesting ants that marched in and out in their myriad streams. Detecting the sweet, sugary scent on his body, they quickly fastened their tiny jaws in his skin, wounding him deeply with endlessly repeated bites until after interminable torment he died. His flesh and his innards were totally consumed, and his body stripped to the bare bones, which gleaming a brilliant white were left tied to the tree. Whoa. Auctioned. Having fled from that detestable halt, leaving the residence in the depths of mourning, We traveled on again, and marching all day over the plain arrived, exhausted, at a well-known populous city. The herdsmen decided to make their home and permanent residence there, as seeming to offer a safe retreat far from anyone who might search for them, and also attracted by the abundance of rich and plentiful food. After 3 days' rest to restore the animals and render us more saleable, we were taken off to market. In a loud voice, the auctioneer announced our prices, but while the horses and other asses were sold to some wealthy man, I alone remained, an unsold item, scorned and discussed. I was angered by now at being pawed by buyers trying to guess my age from my teeth. So when a man with foul-smelling hands kept scraping my gums again and again with his fetid fingers, I grabbed his hand with my teeth and crushed it to a pulp. This rid those standing by of any desire to buy a creature so ferocious. So the auctioneer, whose voice was cracked and hoarse, began to utter witticisms at my expense. How long must this old nag stand here without a sale? Poor old thing. He's crippled by worn-out hooves, deformed from pain, and totally lazy except when he's being vicious. His skin's fit for nothing but making a garbage sieve. So I'll give him away to any man who won't mind wasting fodder. With such remarks, the auctioneer had the crowd roaring with laughter. But cruel and savage fortune, whom my flight across the land had not eluded, unplacated by my earlier sufferings, turned her blind gaze once more in my direction, and amazingly put me in the way of the very purchaser to add to my harsh misfortunes. Learn what he was, a eunuch, and an old one at that, bald at the top with ringlets of old gray circling his scalp. The scum of society, one of the dregs who frequent the city streets, sounding their cymbals and castanets, dragging the Syrian great goddess round with them, using her to beg. He was more than eager to buy me, and asked where I came from. Oh, he's a fine Cappadocian, a strong little chap, the auctioneer cried. And how many years had I? Well, the auctioneer replied, the astrologer who did his chart said he was 5. But no doubt a citizen who fills in his census returns, he can tell you the answer better than I. It's a crime, of course, to sell you a Roman citizen as a slave. That's the Cornelian law. Still, why not buy yourself this fine and useful piece of property? Who'll give you satisfaction at home and abroad. This odious buyer kept on asking one question after another, and finally asked anxiously how docile I might be. This is no ass you see before you. It's a bellwether of the flock, never a biter or kicker, but gentle as a lamb for any task. You'd think, said the auctioneer, that inside the ass's head lived the mildest of human beings. It's not hard to prove either. Just stick your face between his legs and you'll easily demonstrate his true passive nature. The auctioneer was having fun at the eunuch's expense, but the latter got the point of the joke and swore with feigned indignation. You lunatic, you deaf and dumb corpse of an auctioneer, I call on the all-powerful, the all-creating goddess, Syrian Atagartis, and holy Sabazius too, and Ma of the Commagene, and Idaean mother Cybele and her consort Attis, on Lady Astarte and her consort Adonis. May they strike you blind as well for tormenting me with your scurrilous jests. Do you think I'd entrust the goddess, you fool, to some savage creature that might tumble her sacred image from its back and be forced to run round like a servant girl, her hair streaming in the wind, to find a doctor for my goddess as she lay there on the ground? Hearing that, it crossed my mind to start leaping round like a mad. So he'd give up the whole idea of buying me when he saw how savage I was when roused. But that eager purchaser thwarted my scheme by paying a price on the nail that my owner, of course, being doubtlessly thorough sick and tired of me, swiftly and joyfully accepted. Less than a single gold piece, 17 denarii, he handed me over at once with the halter made of common broom to this Phalebus, for such was the name of the man who was my new owner. Oh, wow. So much to unpack here, right? So we're dealing with someone who is a eunuch, someone who's gone through the rites, the mystery rites of the Great Mother. And then when he's invoking stuff here, look at who he's invoking. Atagartis, Sabazius, right? The Cybele, Attis, Astarte, Adonis. All he's missing is Dionysus and Aphrodite. You know, he's really showing you this deep connection between these mother goddess cults and how they were viewed as one common thing. You know, even though they had variations. It's really interesting. The Idaean mother Cybele, Ma of the Commagene. Wow. All right, let's continue. With the wandering eunuchs, taking possession of his new follower, he dragged me home with him, and reaching the doorway cried, "Look what a pretty slave I've brought you, girls." The girls were his troop of eunuchs, who began dancing in daylight, raising a dissonant clamor with tuneless, shrill, effeminate cries, thinking no doubt his purchase was a slave boy ready to do them service. But on seeing me, no doe, replacing a sacrificial virgin, but an ass instead of a boy, they turned up their noses and made caustic remarks to their leader. "He's no slave," one cried, "but a husband of your own." "And oh," called another, "don't swallow that little morsel all by yourself. Give your little doves the occasional bite." Then amidst the banter, they tied me to the manger. Now in that house was a corpulent lad, a fine flute player, brought to the slave market with the funds from their begging plate, who circled round playing his pipes when they led the goddess about, but at home played the part of concubine, sharing himself around. Seeing me now, he smilingly set up a heap of fodder before me, and said with delight, "At last you're here to take turns at this wretched work. Live to please our masters, and give my weary muscles a rest." On hearing this, I began to wonder what new ills were in store. Next day they prepared to do their rounds, dressing in bright array, beautifying their faces unbeautifully, daubing their cheeks with rouge and highlighting their eyes. Off they went in turbans and saffron robes, all fine linen and silk, some in white tunics woven with purple designs and gathered up in a girdle, and with yellow shoes on their feet. The goddess they wrapped in a silken cloak and set her on my back, while they, arms bared to the shoulder, waving frightful swords and axes, leapt about and chanted in a frenzied dance to the stirring wail of the flute. Passing a few small hamlets in our wanderings, we came to a rich landowner's country house. On reaching the gate, they rushed in wildly, filling the place with tuneless cries, heads forward, rotating their necks in endless circling motions, their long pendulous hair swinging around them. Now and then wounding their flesh savagely with their teeth, and at the climax, slashing their arms with the double-edged knives they carried. One in their midst began to rave more ecstatically than the rest, heaving breaths from deep in his chest, simulating a fit of divine madness, as if filled with inspiration from some god, though surely the presence of a deity should make men nobler than themselves, not disorder them or make them lose their senses. But behold, the benefit he won from these heavenly powers. Raving like a prophet, he began to chastise himself with the concocted tale of some sin of his against the sacred laws of religion, and demanded self-punishment for his guilt. Then he snatched up the whip, the insignia of those emasculated creatures, with its long tufts, strands of twisted sheep's hide, strung with those animals' knuckles bones, and scourged himself savagely with strokes on its knotted lash, showing amazing fortitude given the pain from his gashes. The ground grew slippery with blood from the flashing blades and flailing whips, and I grew very uneasy at this gory flood from the countless wounds, lest the Syrian goddess might have a stomach for ass's blood, yearning for it as some humans do for ass's milk. But when they were weary at last of self-flagellation, or at least were sated, they ceased their antics and took up collection, people vying for the pleasure of dropping copper coins and even silver into the ample folds of their robes. They were also given a fat jar of wine with milk and cheese, cornmeal and flour, and even a feed of barley for me, the goddess's beast of burden. They gathered it greedily, plied it into the sacks persistently, acquired to carry the takings and heap them on my back, now weighed down by a double load. I was a walking shrine and a storage chest in one. Imminent death. In this manner they roamed about, plundering the whole region. One day, delighted with a larger than usual take in some hill town, they decided on a festive banquet. On the back of a fictitious prophecy, they extracted a farmer's fattest ram for sacrifice, needing, they said, to appease the goddess's hunger. Once the preparations were done, they paid a visit to the bathhouse, returning afterwards with a guest, a strapping countryman, with strong limbs and thighs. They barely tasted their salad hors d'oeuvres before those vile creatures were driven by their unspeakable urges to commit the vilest acts of perverse lust. They soon had the young man naked on his back, and crowding round him forced their foul caresses on him. My eyes could not long endure such an outrage. I cried to call out, "No, no, help, citizen, help." But all that emerged was "ooh, ooh," with all the rest of the syllables lost. A fine and clear and strong and ass-like cry, but sadly and inopportunely timed. For a crowd of lads from a neighboring village out looking for an ass stolen in the night, who were searching all the stables thoroughly, heard me braying from the house, and assumed their stolen property was hidden somewhere there. Determined to win their goods back on the spot, they burst in all together to catch my masters performing their vile abominations. In a tryst, they roused the neighbors and shouted to everyone to come and witness the wretched scene, pouring ridicule on the priests with caustic praise for their chastity. Confounded by the scandal, the news of which spread swiftly from mouth to mouth, and made them justly despised and detested in the eyes of all. They gathered their belongings, and at midnight we stealthily left town. Before sunrise, we'd completed the best part of a day's journey, and by the time it was fully light, had reached a deserted wilderness. There, after holding a long discussion among themselves, they girded themselves for my punishment. They dismounted the goddess from my back and set her on the ground, then stripped me of all the tackle and tied me to an oak. They then flogged me with one of those whips of theirs, stung with sheep bones, until I was well nigh dead. One of them threatened to hamstring me with an axe, because I brayed so offensively at his pretense of snow-white virtue, while the rest voted to keep me alive, not out of consideration for me, but for the goddess statue lying there on the ground. So they burdened me again with the baggage, beating me with the flat of their swords till we reached the next large town. There, one of the notables, a religious man with a particular reverence for that goddess, roused by the cymbals tinkling, the drums beating, and the plaintive music of Phrygian flute, came running out to meet us, and receiving the goddess with hospitality of a devotee, he settled us within the walls of his extensive mansion, and strove to win the goddess's favor with deep reverence and rich sacrifice. Here I recall there arose a particularly grave risk to my life. One of our host's tenants had been out hunting and sent his master the gift of a large and succulent haunch of venison from some mighty stag. They had been hung by the kitchen door, but negligently not high enough off the ground. Thus a hound, also a connoisseur of venison, snatched it on the quiet, and overjoyed at his catch, swiftly removed himself from watchful eyes. When Hephaestion, the cook, realized his loss, he blamed himself and shed many a tear in vain. When his master requested the venison for dinner, the cook plunged into deep terror and dejection. He found a rope and tied a noose in it, ready for suicide, then said a fond farewell to his situation. Divine Providence had provided the perfect remedy. If you can still see clearly despite fortune's dreadful storm, wake up and listen to me. Take that ass that's just arrived to some out-of-the-way spot and slit his throat. Then cut off a haunch to replace the one that's lost. Stew it till tender and add a really savory gravy, and serve that to the master instead of the other. That worthless rascal was pleased with the thought of my dying to save his skin, and with lavish praise for his wife's sagacity, began to sharpen his knife for the imminent butchery. Book 9, The Rabid Dog. There was the vile executioner, arming his impious hand against me. But the extreme proximity of danger sharpened my thoughts, and without waiting to reflect, I chose to escape impending slaughter by sudden flight. Breaking the halter in a tryst, I set off at full speed for the good of my health, lashing out repeatedly with my hooves. I'd soon crossed the courtyard nearby and burst at once into the dining room where the owner was hosting a banquet for the goddess's priests. Charging headlong, I collided with no small list of furniture, including the tables and lamps which I upset. The owner was incensed at the vile commotion I made, calling me savage and wild, ordering a servant to lock me up in some safe place to stop me disrupting their peaceful meal again with such impudent tricks. But having saved myself by this cunning stratagem, snatching myself from the butcher's very hands, I was delighted with the security of my death-defying prison. But in truth, if fortune so decrees, nothing turns out right for human beings. Neither wise counsel nor clever devices can subvert or remold the fated workings of divine providence. In this case, a similar event to that which seemed to have worked my instant salvation threatened further danger, or rather, risk of imminent destruction. While the guests were quietly talking amongst themselves, it seemed an excited slave burst into the dining room, his face twitching and trembling, to tell his master the news that a rabid dog from the nearby alley had just broken in through the back gate. This bitch, in a red-hot blaze of fury, had attacked the hounds, then invaded the stable and assaulted the pack animals with equal violence. Not even the humans had been spared. In trying to drive her off, Myrtilus, the muleteer, Hephaestion, the cook, Hypaterius, the butcher, Apuleius, the household physician, along with several others of the servants too, had all been severely bitten in various places. Many of the pack animals had turned rabid and wild, infected by the poisonous bites. This was shocking news. In thinking my mad behavior had been due to the same disease, they snatched up all sorts of weapons and set out to kill me, urging each other on to attack this common death threat, though it was they who were filled with madness, and no doubt they'd have hacked me limb from limb with their spears and lances and double-headed axes, which the servants quickly supplied. Had I not seen the tempest of trouble approaching, and fled from my cell into my master's bedroom, they shut and bolted the door behind me, and laid siege to the place to wait, free of the risk of contact, for me to be progressively weakened by the unrelenting nature of that lethal illness, and die. So I thus was left alone, embraced fortune's gift, pure solitude. I threw myself on the bed and slept the sleep of a human being for the first time in a while. It was broad daylight when I rose, refreshed from my weariness by the softness of the bed. The guards who'd been on sentry duty, watching all night outside the door, were discussing what state I might be in, so I listened. Is that wretched ass thrashing about in a fit, do you think? Perhaps the illness has passed its peak and exhausted itself by now. To resolve the matter, they chose to investigate. They peered through a crack in the door and found me standing there quiet, sane, and healthy. So they opened the door to test my placidity more surely. One, a savior sent from heaven, I'd say, proposed a trial to the others to test the state of my health. They'd offer me a pail of fresh water to drink, and if I drank the water willingly and fearlessly in the normal way, they'd know I was well and rid of hydrophobia. But if I spurned the liquid and panicked on seeing it, they'd be certain the rabies was still there in my system, that being the proper means of diagnosis as spelled out in the old texts. They agreed to try and had soon fetched a large pail of crystal clear water from the spring nearby and hesitantly presented it to me. Without delay, I started forward to meet them, bending my head and immersing it completely, thirstily gulping down those truly life-giving waters. I tranquilly accepted their slapping me with their hands, tugging at my ears, pulling at my halter, and the other tests they chose to make, till I'd clearly proven my gentleness to all and overturned any presumption I was mad. Having in this way twice escaped from peril, on the next day I was loaded with the sacred accoutrement and with the castanets and cymbals and led to the road again on our mendicants' rounds. After stopping at several hamlets and walled estates, we halted at a village built on the half-ruined site of a wealthy city. Or so we were told. We found lodgings at the nearest inn, and there we heard a fine story about a certain poor workwoman deceived by his fate, deceived by his wife, which I'd like you to hear. The lover in the jar. Laboring away in poverty, this leanest of fellows made a living by doing jobbing work for little pay. He had a wife as lean as himself, but rumored to be the ultimate in lasciviousness. One day, after had left in the early morning to go to his current job, a bold adulterer slipped secretly into his house. But while the two were happily striving away at Venus's sport, the husband suddenly came home, not expecting in his ignorance anything of the sort, and finding the doors locked and bolted. He praised his wife's virtue in his thoughts, and knocked on the door, announcing his presence with a whistle. Now the wife, astute and cunning in all those kinds of games, pushed her lover from the close embrace, and hid him from view in an empty storage jar, half buried in an angle of the room. Then she flung the door wide, and as her husband entered, assailed him with a furious tirade. "What are you doing ambling around, hands in pockets, with that vacant, idle look? Is this the way you win us a living and put food on the table, absenting yourself from work? Here I sit in this miserable home of ours, wearing my fingers to the bone, spinning wool night and day so we can at least keep oil in the lamp. How much happier than I my neighbor Daphne is. She spends her days eating and drinking and dallying with her lovers." Then the husband was astounded. "What's all this about? The boss is involved in a lawsuit and gave us the day off. But I've still taken care of supper. You see how much space that storage jar takes up? That's always empty and serves no purpose except to cramp our living space. Well, I've sold it to someone for 5 denarii, and he's on his way to collect it and pay. So while we're waiting, tuck up your skirt and lend me a hand to dig it up. Then the purchaser can take it straight away." A born deceiver. The wife gave a bold laugh and said, "What a brilliant husband I've got, a masterly negotiator. I, a mere woman without stepping outside, just sold for 7 denarii something he's offloaded for less, pleased with the higher price." The husband asked, "Who had paid that for it?" Quiet, you fool," she cried. "He's there. He's climbed down into the jar to see whether it's quite sound." Now the lover took his cue from the wife's words and swiftly emerged. "To tell you the truth, madam," he cried, "this jar of yours is pretty old and badly cracked in a host of places." Then he turned to the husband, pretending not to know who he was. "You then, my man, whoever you are, look sharp and hand me the light so I can scrape off a layer of dirt and see if it's fit for use, unless you think money grows on trees." Without a moment's delay and suspecting nothing, that fine genius of a husband lit the lamp and saying, "Step aside, mate. You take a rest. I'll clean it up and to show you." He took off his shirt, lowered the lamp inside, and began to hack at the solid crust of the ancient receptacle. At once, the adulterer, fine lad that he was, bent the man's wife face down over the jar and toyed with her at his ease, while she, the cunning little whore, poked her head right into the jar and made a fool of her husband, pointing her finger at places to clean here and there and elsewhere again and again, till, with both jobs now complete, she pocketed the 7 denarii, and the poor husband, hoisting the jar on his back, had to carry it off to her lover's lodgings. The eunuchs stayed a few days, fattening themselves at public expense, replete with the proceeds of their fortune-telling. Those most holy of priests devised a novel variant on such ventures. They composed an all-purpose prophecy that would fit every situation, and fooled a host of people who came to consult them on every sort of matter. The prophecy ran like this: "Yoked together, these oxen plow the soil. To bring rich seed to future birth they toil." So, for example, if they chanced to be consulted on the suitability of a particular marriage, they'd say the oracle was favorable, and the yoke of marriage would nurture seeds of children. If instead it was a question of property, then oxen, yokes, and flourishing fields of seed were all involved. If someone sought divine auspiciouses regarding a journey, they'd imply the tamest four-footed beasts were all but yoked together, and rich seed foretold a profitable trip. If a man was off to fight a battle or chase a band of thieves and wanted to know if the outcome would be good, they'd argue that victory was guaranteed by that same blessed prophecy. The enemy's necks would go under the yoke, while a rich and plentiful heap of spoils would be the clear result. With this cunning method of divination, they raked in a pile of cash, but they soon grew weary, tired of the endless requests for oracles, and set out on the road again. The journey was even worse than that previous one by night, for the way was marked by waterlogged ditches and places pitted with stagnant pools, and others thick with slippery mud. My legs were aching from the constant stumbles and incessant sliding, and exhausted, I could barely reach the level track at last, when suddenly we were overtaken by a body of armed men. Curbing their horses' headlong gallop, with great difficulty they rounded savagely on Philebus and his troop, and grasping them by their throats, denouncing them as a vile temple robbers, began to pummel them with their fists. Then, handcuffing them all, they demanded in no uncertain terms that they hand over the golden goblet, the spoil of their crime, which they'd secretly stolen from the shrine of the Mother of the Gods, while pretending to hold arcane ceremonies. And then, as though they thought they could evade all punishment for the outrage by leaving silently, sneaking out of the city in the half-light of dawn. One of them went so far as to lean over my back, and rummaging around in the robes of the goddess I was bearing, found the golden goblet, and flourished it for all to see. Yet, even faced with this accusation of sacrilegious crime, those impure creatures were neither frightened nor dismayed, but made unfortunate jests and laughed it off. The perversity and injustice of it all! How often the innocent are accused of crime, simply for one little cup, which the Mother of Gods gave her sister, the goddess of Syria, as a token of friendship with her sacred high priests. We, her sacred high priests, are labeled criminals and exposed to danger. This and similar sorts of nonsense they babbled about in vain, since they were led back to town, clapped in chains, and locked in a gaol, while the goblet and the image of the goddess I was carrying were sent to the temple's treasury and reconsecrated. Next day, I was taken out and sold again at auction. A miller and baker from a nearby town bought me for 7 sestertii, more than Philebus paid, swiftly loaded me with heavy sacks of grain he purchased, and led me by a steep and perilous track, full of tangled roots and jagged stones, to the mill and bakehouse that he ran. Oops. At the mill. There the endless gyrations of numerous beasts termed millstones of varying size, and not only by day but all night long the ceaseless turning of the wheels perpetually made flour. My master gave me a generous welcome, making my first day a holiday, and lavishly filling my manger with fodder, no doubt to keep me from feelings of terror at the prospect of slavery. But that pleasant period of feeding and idleness was brief enough, since early the following morning I was harnessed to what seemed the largest wheel of the mill. My head was covered with a sack, and I was once given a shove along the curving track of its circular bed. In a circumscribed orbit, ever retracing my steps, I traveled on that fixed path. However, I'd not completely lost my intellect and cunning, and made it look as though, as an apprentice to the trade, I was very slow learner. Though as a human being I'd often see mill wheels turned in a similar way, I pretended to ignorance of the process, and as a novice stood rooted to the spot in a feigned stupor. I hoped, you see, I'd be judged useless and unfit for that sort of work, and demoted to some other easier task, or even put out to pasture. But I exercised that wretched cunning of mine to no avail, for several lads, armed with sticks, had soon surrounded me, and while I stood there suspecting nothing because my eyes were hooded, They suddenly shouted all together on signal and laid into me with a fury of blows, so scarring me with their cries, I abandoned my scheme in a hurry, tugged furiously at the halter with all my strength, and swiftly performed the circuits prescribed, raising a howl of laughter at my sudden change of heart. When the day was mostly past and I was weary, they unharnessed me, removed my collar, and tied me to the manger. Though I was utterly exhausted, urgently in need of restoring my strength, and almost dead from hunger, still my usual sense of curiosity kept me upright with its nagging. I neglected the pile of fodder, and was pleased to watch the life of that detestable mill. You blessed gods, what a pack of dwarves those workers were, their skins stripped with livid welts, their seamed backs half visible through the ragged shirts they wore, some with loincloths, but all revealing their bodies under their clothes, foreheads branded, heads half shaved, and feet chained together. They were wretchedly sallow, too, their eyes so bleary from the scorching heat of that smoke-filled darkness they could barely see. And like wrestlers sprinkled with dust before a fight, they were coarsely whitened with floury ash. As for my fellow creatures, what a sight! How to describe their fate or their state? Those senile mules and worn-out geldlings drooped their heads over the manger as they munched their heaps of chaff, necks bent and covered with vile running sores, flabby nostrils descended from endless weaving, and their chests raw from the constant friction of the harness. Their flanks were cut to the bone from relentless whipping, their hooves distorted to strange dimensions from the repetitive circling, and their whole hide botched by mange and hollowed by starvation. The sorry lot of my companions made me fear for myself, and recalling the fortunate Lucius I once was, now lost in degradation, I bowed my head in mourning. There was only the one consolation for my sad existence, in that everyone freely did and said whatever they wished in my worthless presence. And so my natural curiosity had revived. Homer, the divine creator of ancient poetry among the Greeks, desiring to depict a hero of the highest intellect, rightly chose to sing of Odysseus, whose powers were refined by seeing many cities and knowing the minds of many men. And I now remember the ass I was with an infinite gratitude, since concealed in his hide and meeting with those ups and downs of fortune gave me all sorts of knowledge, even though I was less than wise. Thus, here comes a tale, better than many another and sweetly presented, which I've decided to offer to your hearing, and away we go. The miller's wife. The miller who had bought me was altogether a good and sober man, but he'd married the worst of women, wholly wicked, who so dishonored his house and bed that even I, by Hercules, groaned inwardly for his sake. That dreadful woman lacked not a single fault, but every evil flowed through her soul as if through some vile sewer, mean and malicious, drunk on dalliance, wildly willful, as grasping in her petty thefts, as wasteful in her mad extravagance, inimical to loyalty, an enemy to chastity. And then she detested and scorned the heavenly powers, and in place of true religion, presumed to worship a false and sacrilegious deity she called the only God, inventing fantastic rites to mislead everyone and deceive her poor husband, that excused her tipping wine from dawn and playing the whore all day. Being the sort of woman she was, she persecuted me with unbelievable hatred. Before dawn, she'd shout while still in bed for that new ass to be harnessed to the wheel, and the instant she left her room, she'd cry for me to be whipped over and over while she stood and watched. Then, while all the other creatures were sent to dinner on time, it was only much later that I was fed. Her cruelty greatly sharpened my natural curiosity as to her other behavior, since I noticed a young fellow often visiting her room, and I wished with all my heart I could see his face, if only the sack over my head had allowed me the slightest glimpse. My cunning would not have failed to gain an insight into that dreadful woman's scandalous going-ons. There was an old woman who was her confidant, her inseparable companion all day, every day, and acted as go-between in her affairs and debaucheries. First thing after breakfast, after some mutual draughts of pure wine, the wife would play lying charades with subtle twists for the better deception of her poor husband. As for me, though Fotis's mistake in turning me into an ass instead of a bird still rankled greatly, at least I had gained one solace from that wretched and painful change of form. Namely, with my vast ears, I could hear everything clearly, even at some considerable distance. So one morning, the following words from her cautious old confidant drifted to those same ears. Mistress, you must do something about that weak and timid lover of yours, the one you chose without asking me, who trembles at the blink of an eyebrow from your odious and disagreeable husband, and frustrates your willing arms so with the uselessness of his turgid loving. How superior, young Philestheris, 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 how superior, young Philesiceras is handsome, generous, strong, and fiercely loyal in opposing a husband's intellectual wiles. He alone, by Hercules, is worthy to enjoy a wife's favors. His head alone deserves to wear the golden crown, if for no other reason than the clever way he tricked a certain jealous husband recently. Listen and compare the differing tales of these two lovers. You know Barabbas, the town councillor, the one they call Scorpion because of his poisonous nature? Well, he married a truly lovely girl of good family, but keeps her locked up tight in his house with a strict watch over her. Why, yes, said the miller's wife, I know her well. It's Arete, whom I went to school with. Well, then, the old woman said, you'll know the tale of Philesiceras too? Why, no, was the reply, but I'd like to hear it greatly. So unravel it, my dear, from beginning to end. The tale of Arete and Philesiceras. Philesiceras. Myrmex. The old chatter at once began. This Barabbas had a journey to make, and since he wished to be sure of his wife's faithfulness, he gave secret instructions concerning her to the Myrmex, his servant, whom he firmly trusted. He charged him with guarding the lady, threatening incarceration, everlasting chains, violent and shameful death, if any man so much as brushed her in passing with his fingertips, and swore it by all the powers of heavens. Then, leaving the worried Myrmex as sharp-eyed custodian of his wife, secure in mind, he set out on his way. Myrmex, intensely anxious, firmly refused to let his mistress leave the house. He sat by her side while she worked at her household task of spinning wool, and was close behind when Arete went to the baths in the evening, holding the hem of her robe in his hand, displaying marvelous tenacity in the demanding role with which he was entrusted. But there was no way to hide the noble lady's beauty from Philesiceras. Philesiceras' ardent gaze. He was aroused and kindled in the extreme by her very reputation for chastity, and the concerned, sure that all difficulties cash will overcome, that gold can open even adamantine doors. Taking advantage of Myrmex being alone, he revealed his passion for Arete, and begged for help to ease his agony, since he decided and resolved to hasten his own death if he failed to attain his desire. Nor need Myrmex fear so simple a matter. He would sneak in alone at dusk, trusting the shadows would cloak and conceal him, and would be gone again in a tris. Adding to these reassurances, and the like, a powerfully driven wedge to break through the servant's stolid resistance, by holding out his palm on which lay some bright, freshly minted gold pieces, of which 20, he said, were destined for the mistress, but 10 he freely gave to him. Myrmex was horrified at this unheard of approach, and stopping his ears he fled, yet could not rid his thoughts of the coin's glowing splendor. He distanced himself from them and went swiftly homewards, though seeing still in his imagination the gleam of shining gold, and feeling that rich reward within his grasp. His mind was wonderfully disturbed, and the poor man was dragged this way and that, torn by his dilemma. On the one hand, faithfulness, on the other, gain, and on side tortuous punishment, on the other, pleasure. But in the end, gold overcame his fear of death. His love of glittering lucre was not quenched by time, for pestilential avarice poisoned his nighttime thoughts, and no matter how strongly his master's threats urged him to stay home, the lure of gold tempted him forth. Swallowing his shame, laying aside all doubts, he carried Philesiceris' blandishments to his mistress's ear. The woman, not deviating from her gender's natural fickleness, immediately forsook her honor for money. Myrmex, filled with delight, swiftly sought an end to any loyalty to his master, craving not merely to touch but to possess his wealth, which to this shame he had gazed on. He cheerfully announced Philesiceris that his efforts had furthered the youth's wishes, and demanded payment of his reward. Myrmex's palm, that had never known the feel of copper coins, now held gold ones. The tale of Arete and Philesiceris, a narrow escape. Late at night, he let the eager lover into the house, and alone, with head well covered, right to Arete's room, just as they were fighting with their first skirmishes, as naked followers of Venus, just as their first embraces were on the verge of dedicating an offering to untried love. Her husband arrived home, much to their surprise, taking a nocturnal opportunity for an unexpected visit. First he knocked, then he shouted, then, waxing suspicious at the delay, beat at the door with the stone, threatening Myrmex angrily with punishment. He, dismayed at the sudden disastrous turn of events, and reduced to witness by his pietous terror, made the only excuse that came to mind, saying he'd mislaid the key and was having trouble finding it in the dark. Meanwhile, Philesiceris, on hearing the noise, quickly threw on his tunic and ran from the bedroom, forgetting his shoes in confusion. Myrmex then inserted the key in the lock, threw open the door, and let in his master, who was still bellowing oaths at the gods, while Barabbas hastened to the bedroom. Myrmex left Philesiceris out unnoticed, and once the latter had safely crossed the threshold, relieved at his own escape, locked the door and returned to bed. But when Barabbas left the marriage bed at dawn, he found a pair of strange sandals under the bed, the ones that Philesiceris had been wearing when he sneaked into the room. He suspected what had gone on from this evidence, but hiding his heartache from his wife and servants, he simply snatched up the sandals and hid them secretly in his robe. Then he ordered the servants to bind Myrmex by the arms and drag him off to the forum. He himself led the way, pacing hurriedly, quietly muttering to himself, confident of tracing the adulterer given the sandals as a clue. So there was Barabbas, striding furiously down the street, his brow knitted in anger, while behind stumbled Myrmex in chains, who, though not caught red-handed, a guilty conscience troubled, though his floods of tears and pitiful wails of terror were in vain. At this very moment along came Philesiceris, who, although on other business, was shocked at the unanticipated sight, but undeterred recollected what he had forgotten in his swift departure, cleverly sized up the situation, and at once regained his usual self-possession. Pushing the slave aside, he flung himself on Myrmex, shouting at the top of his voice and seeming to strike his face with fists. "Ah, you thief! You lying wretch," he cried, "may your master there and all the gods you invoked with perjurious oaths punish your wicked self wickedly. You it was who stole my sandals yesterday at the baths. You deserve to wear out those chains, by Hercules. You deserve to endure the dark depths of Gaol." The tale of the fuller's wife. At this point, The miller's wife interrupted the garrulous old woman. Happy is she who enjoys the freedom of such steadfast companionship. Sadly, I chose a lover who even fears the sound of the millstone and the face of that mangy ass out there. I'll soon bring you a livelier one, the old woman replied, with good credentials, fully proven, guaranteed to be up to the task. Promising to be back by evening, she departed the leaving wife, that paragon of virtue, to prepare a sumptuous meal, blending fresh sauces from the meat, decanting a vintage wine. Then, with the table richly set, she awaited the advent of her lover, as if he were a deity, her husband, fortuitously dining that night at the fuller's house next door. Thus, as day neared its close, when I was at last freed from my collar and released to carefree rest, I was not only grateful by Hercules to be rid of my task, but with eyes unblinkered, I could freely observe all that wicked woman's wiles, while the sun had slipped beneath the waves and was lighting regions of the underworld. The bold lover made his appearance on the arm of that vile old woman. He was a mere boy, notable for the shiny smoothness of his cheeks, and still a target for male lovers. Welcoming him with a shower of kisses, the miller's wife invited him to sit down to the dinner she prepared. But as he was raising the first cup of wine to his lips, her husband, returning prematurely, was heard approaching the door, that brazen wife, cursing him passionately, expressing the hope he'd trip and break a leg, hid her pale and trembling lover under a large wooden tub, used for sifting flour, that was lying upside down on the ground behind the house. Her natural talent for dissimulation allowed her to conceal her bad behavior, and assuming a perfectly calm expression, she asked her husband why he'd left his best friend's house and was back so early. He clearly, upset, sighing assiduously, replied, "What a terrible, unspeakable crime that wicked woman's committed! It was more than I could endure, so I hastened to escape. Kind gods, to think that so apparently faithful and well-behaved a wife has disgraced herself so shamefully. I swear by that image of sacred Ceres over there, I could scarcely believe my eyes." Stirred by her husband's words, his impudent wife showed her eagerness to hear the tale, and she nagged him to tell the whole story from start, and would not relent till the miller yielded to her wish, and unaware of his own misfortune, related that of his dearest friend, the fuller. His wife, he began, always such a chaste woman, with a firm reputation for virtue, in managing her husband's house, but she been hiding her passion for a secret lover. He's been meeting her constantly for stolen embraces, and at the very moment we returned from the baths for dinner, she and that very youth were making love. Disturbed by her sudden arrival, she was forced to hasty action, hiding him in their wicker cage, a funnel of smooth sticks with a narrow opening at the top, over which they hang the cloths to bleach in the fumes from smoldering sulfur. Once he was safely inside, she happily joined the meal, but meanwhile, the acrid, penetrating smoke was choking the youth, and overcome by the thick cloud, he began to suffocate, and the sulfur, in accord with that active element's nature, caused him to sneeze and go on sneezing. On hearing the sound of this, which came from behind the wife's back, we, though it was her, and wished her good health as normal. We thought it was her, and wished her good health as normal. But when the same thing happened again and again, my friend, sensing something wrong, finally realized the truth. Pushing the table aside, he raised the cage and dragged out the youth, who was struggling for breath, blazing with anger, indignant at the dishonor. My friend the fuller called for his sword and would have cut the throat of the fainting man, if I, out of fear of the law, had not restrained him from violent action. I told him his enemy would soon be dead from the powerful effects of the sulfur, and our hands moreover would be clean, and persuaded less by my argument than the obvious circumstance that the fellow was only half alive, he had hauled him outside into the alley. Then I spoke to the wife quietly and persuaded her, finally, to leave the house for the moment and go off to some woman's friends until time had mollified her husband's furious wrath. Since he was in the grip of such a fit of anger, I was certain he contemplated inflicting some dreadful injury on his wife and on himself. That's how loathsome our dinner party ended, and I was driven to seek refuge at my own hearth. Exposure. While the miller told his story, his wife, as impudent as ever, roundly cursed the fuller's wife, decrying her for a shameless, faithless disgrace to the whole sex, in staining her chastity, trampling the bonds of marriage underfoot, turning her husband's home into a scandalous brothel, and exchanging her status as wife for that of a common whore. She even claimed the woman should be burnt alive. Aware, though, of her own crime and the secret of a burning conscience, she pondered how to free her own lover from his close confinement, and urged her husband to seek an early night. But he banished an unfinished dinner, and still hungry, requested some food instead. His wife served him quickly, reluctantly feeding him on dainties meant for another. Now my heart ached to its depths at the thought of that dreadful woman's history of sin and her present crime, and I tried hard to think of any way to help my master by revealing and exposing her deceit, and uncovering that fellow hidden like a tortoise under the tub for all to see. It was now, tormented by this insult to my master, that divine providence finally smiled on me. It was the hour when the lame old man, entrusted with our care, used to drive all of us animals to the nearby pond to drink. This granted me the chance for vengeance I was seeking. As I trotted by, I caught sight of the ends of the lover's fingers sticking out from underneath his hollow cover. I planted the edge of my hoof on top, applied strong pressure, and crushed them flatter and flatter until he racked with pain. He uttered a wretched cry, lifted the tub, and pushed it away, his sudden appearance disclosing to the world's unknowing eyes the shameless wife's secret affair. The miller, though, seemed barely moved by the wound to his honor, but with calm face and a kind look began to speak in a gentle way to that pallid and trembling lad. You've nothing to fear from me, young man. I'm not Barabbas, nor do I share the boorishness of rustic manners. I'll not take the fuller's savagery as my model and stifle you with lethal fumes, or invoke the law's severity and have such a charming and handsome lad tried on a capital charge under the law on adultery. No, I'll share you with my wife instead, rather than divorce her and split the property. I'll create a partnership with common assets, and without argument or dissent, we three will lie together in the one bed. She and I have always lived in such harmony, in accordance with the precepts of the wise, that we both suit each other. Nevertheless, the principle of equality grants no wife greater rights than her husband. After this mild speech, he led him off to bed, still ribbing the reluctant lad, locking his disgraced wife in the other room. He had the boy and enjoyed the perfect revenge for his ruined marriage. But when the sun's bright orb gave birth to day, he summoned the two strongest servants in the house, who hoisted the lad high and thrashed his backside. You, he said, are but a soft and tender child, so don't go cheating on us of the bloom of your youth, pursuing women, and free women too, breaking up lawfully sanctioned marriage, and claiming the title of adulterer before your time. When he'd done chastising him with the whip and taunting him with such comments and more, he threw him out of the house. Thus the boldest of adulterers ran off in tears, escaping death, which was more than he could have hoped. But with his tender buttocks the worse for a night, and a day's hard wear, and despite his words, the miller gave his wife notice of divorce, and immediately expelled her from the house. Revenge. Now the wife's inborn malice was stimulated and exacerbated by this affront, well deserved though it was. Resorting to her old ways, she turned to those magic arts women employ, and after careful inquiry, she found an old witch, who they said could work anything with spells and like mischief, and begged her with many gifts and much exhortation to either mollify her husband's wrath and bring about a reconciliation, or if that were impossible, send some spectre or dreadful demon to do him violence and expel his spirit. Then the witch, with her supernatural powers, used the primal weapons of her wicked arts against him, trying to turn the greatly aggrieved husband's thoughts towards renewed affection. When this effort was disappointed, unhappy with those otherworldly agents, spurred on by their disdain of her as much as by the promise of reward, she threatened the life of the wretched miller by raising the ghost of a murdered woman to destroy him. Now, perhaps, scrupulous reader, you may find fault with my tale, asking, "Clever little ass, how come if you were imprisoned in the confines of that mill, you could discover what those women were secretly up to as you claim?" Well, let me tell you how an inquisitive man disguised as a beast of burden could find out everything they did to encompass my master's ruin. About noon, the dead woman's spirit appeared inside the mill house, possessed by terrible grief, half clothed in tear-stained rags, her feet bare and unprotected, and she greatly emaciated, pale as boxwood. Her gray, disheveled hair, sprinkled with ashes, hung over her forehead, hiding most of her face. She gently laid her hand on the miller's arm, as if she wished to speak to him privately, led him away to his room, and remained there behind closed doors, with him for a length of time. As all the grain at hand had been milled, and more was needed, the workers stood outside the door and called to their masters for new supplies. When they'd shouted several times loudly without reply, and pounded on the door, finding it securely fastened, and suspecting something gravely wrong, they broke the lock with a powerful heave, and forced their way in. The strange woman was nowhere to be seen, but their master was hanging from a beam, already dead. They'd freed his body from the noose, lowered it, and began to mourn, wailing loudly and beating their breasts. When the corpse was washed and the laying out complete, they carried it off for burial, followed by a large procession. Next day, his daughter arrived in haste from the next town, where she had lived since her marriage. She was already in mourning, shaking her disheveled hair and beating her breasts with her hands, for though the news of the family's misfortunes was not yet abroad, her father's weeping ghost had appeared to her in a dream. The noose around his neck had told her all, her stepmother's crimes of sorcery and adultery, and how the ghost had dispatched him to the shades. Once her long lamentations had ceased, her self-torment restrained by her friends who had gathered round, she left off mourning, and when the rites at the tomb had been duly completed, 8 days later, she auctioned the mill and the contents, the slaves and all the animals. So fickle fortune scattered the various elements of that house. And as for me, a poor market gardener bought me for 50 sestertii, a high price for him to pay, as he said, but he hoped to earn a living from our joint efforts. Signs and portents. I feel I must describe this new regime of slavery too. Each morning I was loaded with piles of vegetation and led to the nearest town. When the gardener had handed his produce over to the traders, he'd return his farm riding on my back. Then, while he bent like a slave himself to his digging, watering, and other tasks, I'd recuperate at leisure in uninterrupted rest. But when the stars, moving in their appointed courses, had passed through days and months, and the years declined from the delights of autumn vintage to wintry frosts under Capricorn, the rain fell all day long, and the nights were wet with dew, while I, shut in an open stall under the bare sky, was tormented by cold. Since my master was so poor, he had to be content with a hut of branches, without a straw mattress or a blanket, let alone one for me. And in the morning I was tortured to death by the freezing mud and sharp lumps of ice that cut my unshod hooves. My belly went in want of the usual fodder, my master and I feeding on the same meager fare, old bitter lettuces, run to seed so long ago they were thin as broom, and a muddy mess of bitter-tasting juice. One moonless night, a farmer from the next village was forced to break his journey, soaked by heavy rain and thwarted by the pitch darkness, and turn his weary horse aside at our small holding. He found a warm reception, all considering, a much needed though not luxurious refuge from the weather, and wanting to repay his kindly host for his hospitality, promised him corn and oil, and 2 quarts of wine from his farm. My master climbed on my bare back with a sack and some empty wineskins, ready to set out promptly on the 7-mile trip. Soon covering the distance, we reached the farm, and there, with the guest, became the courteous host in turn, and invited my master to a sumptuous meal. While they were drinking wine and chatting together, a startling thing occurred. One of the hens ran cackling around the yard, ready to lay an egg. The farmer, seeing her, said, "Good girl, you're the best of layers with that egg you give each day. And now I see you promise us something extra for dinner." And he called a servant. "Put that basket for the laying hens in the usual corner, my lad." The slave did as ordered. But the hen, spurning her usual bed, laid her gift at her master's feet. And not the usual egg, but a fully fledged chick, with claws and feathers, an ominous portent, that with open eyes ran chirping after its mother. Not long after, an even more startling thing occurred, enough to terrify anyone, and rightly so. Under the table which held the leftovers from the meal, a gaping crack appeared, and a huge fountain of blood gushed from the depths below, splashing into the air and spattering the table with crimson drops. While everyone was trembling and staring dumbfounded at these signs from the divine powers, wondering in their astonishment what they may mean, a servant came running from the wine cellar to say the wine casted long before was bubbling in ferment, as though a fire had been laid beneath. Then a weasel was seen dragging a dead snake from its lair. A bright green frog leapt from a sheep's dog's mouth, while an old ram standing by attacked the dog and choked it to death in its jaws. All this array of varying prodigies frightened the master and the servants to death and threw them into an utter stupor. They were at a loss of how to propitiate the heavenly powers. With what kind of sacrifices and how many? Which portent was most important, which least? So which to address first and which later? And while they were all still waiting, numb, expecting some dreadful, a slave came running with news for the farmer of the greatest and worst of disasters. The 3 brothers. Now the farmer had 3 grown sons, the pride of his life, well-educated lads and highly respectable. These 3 young men were old friends of a certain poor neighbor, whose modest cottage adjoined a large and prosperous estate, owned by a wealthy and important young nobleman, one who abused his ancient heritage, won power through faction, and did what he wished freely in the nearby town. He oppressed his humble neighbor, attacking his meager fields, stealing his cattle, slaughtering his sheep, and trampling the crops before they ripened. Having robbed him of the products of his labor, he was now intent on driving him from his land, initiating a lawsuit, redrawing the boundaries of his state, and claiming all the ground as his own. The farmer was a humble man yet, stripped bare by his wealthy neighbor's grief. He wished at least to be buried where his family had always farmed. And so, with trepidation, he'd invited a group of friends to gather formally to mark the boundaries. Among these folk were the 3 brothers, who came to help their friend in whatever way they could in his distress. The young nobleman, however, was not disturbed nor deterred in the slightest by the presence of so many townsmen, and not only denied his plundering, but refused to moderate his wild language. When they remonstrated mildly and attempted to soothe his temper with placatory words, he instantly uttered a binding and sacred oath, swearing on his own life and the lives of his family that not only did he hold these mediators in contempt, but would have his slaves grab the neighbor by his ears and hurl them as far as he could from those lands which was now his own. The listeners were filled with violent indignation, and one of the 3 brothers at once replied boldly that the nobleman's wealth was of no account, nor his tyrannous threats, since the law freely protected the poor farmers from rich men's insolence, now as always. The speech was like pouring oil on flames, adding sulfur to a fire, or taking a whip to a fury, and only served to fuel the noble's savagery. angered to the point of total madness. He cried out that he'd see them all damned and the law too, and commanded the dogs set loose, and turned on the lot of them with orders to kill. These were huge, bloodthirsty watchdogs, fierce hounds that would worry carcasses abandoned in the fields, and trained to savage passers-by at will. Roused by the herdsman's customary cries, they rushed inflamed with rabid intent at the crowd of men, terrifying them with their raucous barking. They leapt on their quarry, wounding their victims all over, ripping and tearing at their flesh. Not even those who tried to flee were spared, as the hounds only chased them down the more fiercely. In the confusion of this butchery of a frightened throng, the young brother stumbled over a rock, stubbing his toe, and fell to the ground, making himself a prey to the savagery of those ferocious hounds. As soon as they saw the defenseless victim, they began to tear at him where he lay. The other two brothers, hearing his screams as if one dying, ran anxiously to his aid. Wrapping their left hands in their cloaks, they threw stone after stone, trying to defend him and drive the dogs away, but failed to subdue them or quell the ferocity. Savagely wounded, the youngest brother uttered his last words: "Avenge my death on that vile bastion of corruption," and he gave up his life. The surviving brothers, blazing with anger, ran towards the nobleman, more with a willing disregard for their own safety by Hercules than in desperation, and furiously pelted him with stones. But the blood-stained assassin, experienced in like acts of violence, hurled his javelin and drove it straight through one of them. Dead though he was, did not fall lightless to the earth, for the spear passing through his body and projecting to its almost full length, due to the power of the blow, stuck in the ground so that the corpse hung there, supported by the taut shaft. Then a big, tall fellow, one of the murderer's slaves, came to his master's aid, slinging a stone in a long arc towards the last surviving brother's right arm. Though the blow was surprisingly ineffectual, merely grazing the fingertips and falling harmlessly to the earth, this slight result, a small mercy, presented the cunning youth with a chance for revenge. Feigning an injury in his hand, he called out to the cruel oppressor, "You may delight in destroying us all, feeding your lust for violence on three brothers' blood, and seeming to triumph over the fellow citizens you've laid low. But know this, that though you steal a poor man's land, however far you extend your boundaries, you will always have to deal with your neighbors. But now, my right hand, which itches to sever your head from your body, is damaged through fate's unjust decree." This speech roused the exacerbated noble still further, and he drew his sword to attack the eager brother to dispatch him with his own hand. But he had met his match. The youth, suddenly contrary to all expectation, seized his opponent's right arm in a fierce grip, turned the weapon, and struck blow after mighty blow until the rich man's evil soul departed his body. Then he swiftly grasped the blade wet with blood and cut his own throat, so escaping the approaching band of his enemy's slaves. Such were the happenings those portents had prophesied. Such were the events reported to the head of the family. Beset by misfortune, the old man was powerless to speak a word or shed a tear, but simply took up a knife that lay beside the food set out for his guests, and imitating his poor son, stabbed at his throat time and again until he fell head downwards across the table, covering the stains from his previously prophetic fount of blood with a freshly flowing stream. Encounter with the soldier. So in a moment, the family ruin was complete. My market gardener, pitying the farmer's misfortune and lamenting deeply over the loss of the promised gifts, had found only tears instead of a meal, and wringing his empty hands, mounted hurriedly on my back and set out to retrace the route we came. Though, as it chanced, he failed to arrive home safely. On the road we met with a tall Roman, a soldier as we saw from his dress and manner, who inquired in a high and mighty voice where my master was going with that ass without a load. But my master, stunned by grief and not understanding his speech, passed him by in silence. The soldier took offense, and unable to quell his natural arrogance, thinking the gardener's silence an insult, knocked him from my back with the centurion's stick he carried. The gardener humbly explained he had no Latin, so the soldier asked him again in Greek, "Where are you off to with that ass of yours?" The gardener said he was going to the next village. "Well, I have need of him," replied the soldier, "to trot with the other pack animals and carry the colonel's baggage from the neighboring fort." He quickly laid hands on me, catching hold of my halter and dragging me off, but the gardener, staunching the blood that flowed from his head caused by the earlier blow, begged the soldier in a comradely way to be more merciful and civil, offering his best wishes for the soldier's future success. Besides, he claimed, this lazy ass is nothing less than the failing syphilis, a terrible disease, and can barely carry a few bags of vegetables from my market garden without getting tired and winded. So think how badly suited he is for bearing large loads. But he soon perceived that the soldier, far from responding to his appeals, had grown more fiercely intent on harming him, resorting to extremes, reversing his vine stick, and striking the gardener's skull with the thick end. Feigning to clasp the soldier's knees to beg for mercy, the gardener stooped down, and bending, grasped his feet, pulled his legs from under him, and sent him crashing to the ground. Then he pounded him, face, arms, and sides, with fists, heads, and elbow, and finally a rock snatched from the road. Though the soldier, once down, was unable to retaliate or even defend himself, he threatened the gardener over and over, crying out that if he could get to his feet, he'd hack him to bits with his sword. At this, the gardener grasped the sword and threw it away, returning again to deal even more savage blows. The soldier, flat on his back, hindered by this attack, and unable to think of anything else to save himself, pretended to be dead. Then the gardener, taking the sword, climbed on my back and headed for town at full speed. Without stopping at his own small holding, he made for a friend's house and told him the full tale, begging him to hide him from danger, along with me, his ass, so that he could lie low for a few days and avoid arrest on a capital charge. The friend, in view of their long relationship, readily undertook the help. They hobbled my legs together and dragged me up the stairs to the attic, while the gardener concealed himself in a chest in the ground floor shop, pulling the lid tight over his hiding place. Meanwhile, as I learned later, the centurion had reached town, stumbling like a man in a drunken stupor, weak from the pain of his various wounds, and barely able to support himself, too ashamed to tell anyone there of his pathetic defeat. He swallowed the affront of his pride in silence, but on meeting a troop of fellow soldiers, told them his tale of woe. They agreed he should hide in their quarters, since in addition to his personal humiliation, the loss of his sword was a breach of military oath and an insult to the guardian deity. Meanwhile, noting our description, they would make a united effort to find us and exact revenge. Inevitably, a treacherous neighbor was there to tell them exactly where we were hiding. The soldiers summoned the magistrates, claiming falsely they'd lost a valuable silver jug on the road, and that the gardener had found it, refused to hand it back, and was concealed at his friend's house. Once the magistrates heard the colonel's name and the magnitude of the loss, they soon arrived at the door, told our host in no uncertain terms that they knew he was hiding us, and ordered him to hand us over or risk capital punishment himself. He was not troubled in the least, however, and eagerly defended the reputation of his friend, whom he'd sworn to save, confessing nothing and claiming he'd not seen the gardener for several days. The soldiers, for their part, swore in the emperor's name that the gardener was there and nowhere else. Despite the friend's stubborn denials, the magistrates determined to search and find the truth. They ordered the lictors and various other officials to go round the four corners of the property and examine it carefully. They reported there was no one to be seen inside, not even the ass. Then the argument grew more intense, the soldiers swearing time and again in the emperor's name that they had received definite information, while the friend called the gods as witness to his rebuttal. Hearing the uproar their violent argument caused, and being inquisitive by nature and an ass with an impulse to restless action, I stuck my head through a little window, trying to find the meaning for all the noise. Just then one of the soldiers, chancing to look in my right direction, caught sight of my shadow. He called to the others to look, and instantly a mighty clamor arose. Some of them ran upstairs, grabbed hold of me, and dragged me downstairs as their prisoner. Their perplexity resolved, they now searched inside the house, examining every corner thoroughly, and at the last opening the chest, found the wretched gardener, pulled him out, and handed him over to the magistrates, who carried him off to the public gaol, no doubt for execution. In the meantime, the soldiers never ceased from jokes and loud laughter about my peeping from the window. Such is the origin of well-known proverbs about great quarrels from trivial causes that claim they're over a peeping ass, or due to an ass's window. All right. Book 10. What became of my gardener the following day, I have no idea. But as for me, the soldier who had won such a lovely beating for his wondrously vile temper took me from the stable without anyone opposing him and led me away. He piled me high with the luggage from what were his barracks, I assume, and set me off up the road, festooned all over and kitted out in military fashion. I carried a brightly gleaming helmet, a shield which shone brighter still, and a spear with a great long shaft, all heaped on the top of this pile of baggage, like a miniature army on its travels, and not on account of regimental orders, but to frighten poor travelers. At the end of a flat and easy journey, we arrived at a small town, where we lodged not at the inn, but at the home of a counselor. Here the centurion gave me into the keeping of a slave, and set off straight away to report to his colonel, who had commanded over 1,000 men. A few days later, a wicked and dreadful crime was committed in the town, which I'll set down here so you can learn of it too. The owner of my lodging had a young, well-educated son, who was in consequence all obedience and good behavior, the kind of son you would wish for your own son. The boy's mother had died years before. The father remarried and had a 12-year-old boy with his second wife. The stepmother held sway, noted more for her beauty than character, either through an innate disregard for her chastity or driven by fate to commit a wholly wicked crime. She turned her eyes longingly on her stepson. So, dear reader, now you know this is no trivial tale but a tragedy, and you've risen from comic slippers to platform shoes. As long as Cupid remained an infant, nourished on simple fare, the stepmother hid her guilty blushes, and silently staved off the love god's weak assaults. But her heart, slowly filling with raging flames, hot frenzied love, at last blazed in her wildly, and she yielded to the savage god. Feigning illness, she tried to pretend her wounded heart was really bodily illness. Now, as sleep and sighs, which are more intense, the more protracted the torment, you'd have thought in her case too high a temperature caused her fever, except that she was also full of tears. Intelligent person, even one who's not a specialist, knows the symptoms of desire. On seeing someone burning without a physical cause, she became more and more agitated by her unbearable ardor. Until at last, breaking her long silence, she summoned to her side this son, whom she would gladly have called by another name to spare her sense of shame. The youth responded at once to his stepmother's requests, entering the patient's bedroom, with as anxious a brow as some melancholy old man, but only out of courtesy to his father's wife and brother's mother. She, long tormented and harassed by her secret, was now, however, aground on a shale of doubt. Every time she grasped at a phrase appropriate for the moment at hand, she rejected it again, and even as her feelings of shame abated, still hesitated as to how to begin her speech. But the youth it was who took the lead, suspecting nothing, with a respectful look asking the cause of her present illness. As they were alone, she seized the moment to speak with dangerous boldness, and weeping floods of tears hiding her face with the hem of her robe, she addressed him briefly in a quivering voice. The whole root and origin of my present illness, as well as my only hope of cure and recovery, is you yourself. Those eyes of yours penetrated my eyes and plunged to the depth of my heart and set the fiercest flames burning in my marrow. Take pity on one who dies because of you, and don't be concerned by your respect for your father, for his wife is at death's door, and you can save her for him. I am right to love you since I see his likeness in your face, and have no fear we are alone. And there is time enough for what is needed. What none know of has scarcely happened. The young man was disturbed by this unexpected trouble, but though he recoiled from the act, he thought it best not to cause a crisis by the harshness of an inopportune refusal, but rather to diffuse it by a guarded promise and seek delay. He urged her with a wealth of assurances to be of good cheer and devote her time to rest and recuperation, until his father's absence might allow them free time for dalliance. Then he hurried from her sight. Deciding that such a challenge to the family honor needed wise counsel, he took the matter to his old and learned tutor. After long deliberation, they both decided that the safest course to escape this cruel storm of fortune was urgent flight. But his stepmother, impatient over the slightest delay, with her ready cunning, invented some pretext or other that persuaded her husband to go and view the situation of his widely scattered rural estates. Once he had left, she, wild with ripened expectation, impetuously demanded that the youth honor his pledge. But he gave one excuse after another to avoid the sight of her whom he detested. When, from the message she received, she realized he had finally reneged on his promise, the volatile woman showed her inconstancy, and illicit love turned to even fiercer hatred. She confided in a slave, acquired as part of her dowry, a villain ready for any crime, apprised him of her treacherous scheme, and agreed it was best to end the poor lad's life. So off the scoundrel went to obtain some swift poison, which he carefully dissolved in wine in preparation for the murder of the innocent boy. But while those two were conferring as to when to offer him the wine, fate chanced to intervene. The younger boy, the stepmother's own son, came home from morning school for his lunch, and feeling thirsty found the wine, already imbued with poison. Ignorant of the danger lurking there, he drank it in one great gulp, and swallowing the venom destined for his brother, fell lifeless to the ground. His servant, terrified at this sudden collapse, raised a cry of horror that brought the mother running along with the whole household. When they realized the tragic turn of events, each called out accusations of a monstrous crime. The vile woman, a perfect type of the wicked stepmother, was untroubled, however, by her own son's cruel death, her guilt for the murder, the family's grief, her husband's mourning, or the pain of the funeral. Instead, she used the catastrophe to further her revenge. She sent a messenger at once to give her husband the tragic news that sent him hastening back from his trip. Then, playing a role of extreme audacity, she claimed her stepson as the cause of her son's death by poison. Indeed, this was not quite utter nonsense, since the younger boy had indeed incurred the death intended for the elder. But she went on to accuse the stepson of murdering his young brother simply because she refused to meet his shameful demands when he sought to seduce her. Not content with these monstrous lies, she added that he'd threatened her too with a sword on being accused of the crime. So now the poor husband, blown about by the winds of misfortune, was threatened with death of his own son. Having witnessed his younger son's funeral, he also knew without a shadow of doubt that the elder would be sentenced to death for incest and fratricide. And then the feigned grief of a wife he loved too well had even quenched his love for his son. The funeral was scarcely over, the procession and burial done, when the wretched man, his cheeks still wet with tears, his ash-strewn hair torn, hastened from the pyre to the forum. There he clutched the counselor's knees, weeping and entreating, ignorant of his vile wife's treacheries, calling, in the full flow of his emotion, for the execution of the living son. He decried him as an incestuous coveter of his father's marriage bed, a murderer stained with a brother's blood, an assassin bent on killing his stepmother. The father's grief and anger roused the council and the people to such overwhelming pity and wrath that the crowd wished to dispense with the formality of a trial, since the persecution case was abundantly clear and his defense would merely be a studied evasion. They shouted as one that the sin against themselves should be punished by themselves, and the murderer crushed beneath a hail of stones. But the magistrates feared damage to their status if mob rule arose from a limited cause. With public order and civic government bypassed, some of them interceded with the counselors. Others remonstrated with the crowd, arguing that a verdict should be given after due process, that the allegations on both sides should be examined, and sentence delivered in a civilized way. In a time of peace and calm, they should not condemn a man unheard, as savages might, or barbarous tyrants. That would be a monstrous precedent for future generations. Their wise advice was taken, and the town clerk ordered to summon the judicial court to the council chamber. All took their seats in order of rank, and at a signal from the clerk, the prosecutor made his case. Eventually, the defendant was summoned, and in accordance with Attic law and the court of the Areopagus, the clerk reminded the defense to avoid a long preamble or attempts to arouse pity. This was how things went, as I learned from overhead conversation. Since I was not in court but tied to my manger, I can't report the actual words the prosecution used or how the defense sought to rebut the charges, the precise debate and discussion in effect. But though I can't report what I didn't hear, I'll set down carefully what I reliably determined. As soon as the lawyers had presented their case, it was decided that definitive tests should be made of the truth and consistency of the charges, so as not to ground such a vital decision on mere speculation. In particular, the slave who'd obtained the poison was thought to be the only witness to all that had happened, was made to take the stand. That candidate for the gallows was not the least bit deterred by the magnitude of the charge, the sight of the packed court or the council chamber, or his own guilty conscience, but gave his own false evidence as if it were true, asserting that the youth, angered by his stepmother's rejection, had summoned him to avenge the insult and kill his mistress's own son, threatening him with death if he refused, then given him the poison mixed with his own hands to administer to the brother, and lastly suspecting him, the slave, of ignoring his orders and keeping poisoned chalice as evidence of crime, had given the brother the cup himself. This account, an all too plausible travesty of the truth, was delivered without a trace of nervousness, and so the trial came to an end. All the counselors seemed convinced the young man's guilt, and that he should be sentenced according to law to be sown in a sack and drowned. It only remained to return a unanimous guilty verdict and cast their written votes in the bronze urn as had been done since time immemorial. Once the ballots were lodged, the defender's fate was sealed. The decision could not be altered, and the executioner was granted power over his life. At this moment, however, one of the elders, an outstandingly well-respected physician of impeccable honesty, covered the mouth of the urn with his hands to stop anyone thoughtlessly casting his vote, and made the following speech to the court. Having lived happily to a ripe old age and enjoyed a good reputation among you, there is no way I can allow a defendant to fall victim to false accusations. It would be tantamount to murder, nor can I permit you, bound as you are by oath to judge rightly, to accept this perjury, the lies of a worthless slave. I cannot myself evade moral obligation and bring in faulty verdict against my own conscience. Listen to me and learn the facts. The scoundrel of a slave came to me a while ago and offered me 100 gold pieces for a quick-acting poison. He claimed it was needed for a man who was ill, when tortured by the slow progression of an incurable disease, who wished to free himself from his torment. Hearing the clumsy pretext given by this garrulous rascal, and thinking he might be planning some crime, I gave him the poison, but took precautions in case that were true. I did not take the money proffered, but told him to seal the sack of money with his ring, in case some of the gold was counterfeit, and I'd have it verified tomorrow in a banker's presence. So I convinced him to set his seal on the business, and as soon as this case was called, I ordered a servant to run and bring the sack from my premises. He has arrived. Here is the sack, which I set before you as evidence. Let him look and admit to his own seal. How can the brother be accused of buying the poison when this slave is the one who did so? 10:10. Tale of the Wicked Stepmother, Resurrection. At this, the rascal of a slave began to tremble violently. His normal color was succeeded by a deathly pallor, and a cold sweat bathed his entire body. He shifted his weight from one foot to another, scratched his head, and babbled such inarticulate nonsense through his half-closed mouth that no one surely could have thought him free of guilt. Yet recovering his composure, he resolutely denied everything and repeatedly accused the doctor of lying. The latter, finding his own honesty impugned and the integrity of the legal process undermined, refuted the man's word with redoubled energy, and finally, at the magistrate's command, the officers of the court removed the iron seal ring from the slave's finger and matched it to the wax impression on the sack. The exact fit confirmed their suspicions. Nor in the Greek manner did they refrain from the torments of the wheel and the rack, yet the slave suffered them with marvelous obduracy, not yielding even to the soles of his feet being burned or beaten. The doctor then claimed, I cannot allow the court to commit injustice and execute an innocent young man, or allow this rogue to make a mockery of our due process and escape the consequences of his evil deed. Now I must reveal all the facts. The rascal asked me for a deadly poison, yet I believe it against my profession to offer anyone the means to further death or destruction, since I was always taught that medicine is devised to heal and not harm. Yet I feared, if I refused, I would not prevent a crime by my preparatory denial, that he'd procure a fatal poison elsewhere, or accomplish his deadly design in the end by the use of a sword or other weapon. So I gave him a drug, mandragora, known for its soporific effect, which produces a death-like coma. No wonder the prisoner resisted your torture so readily, since with the death penalty decreed in the case of murder, he is desperate to keep silent. However, the boy, if he only took the medicine I mixed with my own hands, is still alive and in sleep. Once rested, he will rise from his deep coma and return to a walking state. But if he has been killed, if death has intervened, you must seek the reason for that death elsewhere. The old man's testimony convinced them, and they hurried to the sepulchre where the boy's body lay entombed. Counselors, nobles, commoners alike all streamed to the palace in their excitement. The father raised the lid of the sarcophagus with his own hand, and behold, he found his son rousing himself from a death-like sleep, having been held back from the fatal threshold. Clasping him tightly, lost for words to express his joy at the moment, he then led him outside to show the crowd. The boy was brought before the court, swathed and cloaked as he was in his burial shroud. Now the naked truth was revealed, and the evil slaves and the more evil stepmother's crimes were clearly known. The stepmother was to be sentenced to perpetual exile. The slave was crucified, and by mutual agreement, the good doctor was allowed to keep the gold paid for his opportune prescription. As for the father, his tale of unwelcome notoriety and ill fortune had an ending worthy of divine providence. He who barely a moment before, a brief instant, had been at risk of being rendered childless, was once more the father of 2 young sons. I'm getting pretty tired. I think I'm going to pause here, guys, at 10:13, and we will pick up and finish this tomorrow because there's quite a bit left here. Yeah, so 10:15 is the stopping point. All right, or 10:13. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I hope that was a lot of fun. I hope you're getting a kick out of this story. Lots of magic, lots of wildness, so much fun. All right, everyone. I need to rest my voice and drink some water. Peace and love. Take care, and I'll see you later tonight for some live tarot, and tomorrow for more Apuleius the Golden Ass. Take care, everyone.